White supremacy and racism have been part of South Africa's history from the beginning. The indigenous San and Coco peoples of South Africa had lived in the area for thousands of years before European colonists arrived. The Dutch first colonized South Africa in 1652. The Dutch East India Company instructed John van Riebeck and 90 other men to build a fort and a vegetable garden for men on the eastern trade route. The indigenous peoples of South Africa were looked down upon by the Dutch. The Dutch East India Company instructed van Riebeck to avoid any contact with the indigenous population beyond offering them gifts and trinkets to barter for fresh meat. No other relations, no attempt to educate, convert, or subjugate. Apartheid laws in place in South Africa from 1949 to 1994 meant that the white minority had much more power than the black majority. The beginning of apartheid was marked by the election of Daniel Malan and the Nationalist Party. Malan gathered support and became the Prime Minister of South Africa with a campaign that fed white people's fear of black threat and promising to keep the white in power by oppressing the blacks with harsh legislation. Mixed marriages were outlawed in 1949. A year later, any sexual act between races was made criminal, with the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1950. Beginning that same year, all people born in South Africa were racially classified as white, colored, people of mixed race, or African. These three groups were then forcefully separated into separate residential areas. The first piece of legislation that allowed this to happen was called the Group Areas Act of 1950. Further legislation by Malan and the Nationalist Party deemed any anti-apartheid activity communist and therefore illegal, and the education system also became segregated. Not surprisingly, these laws had a profoundly negative effect on non-white racial groups. The whites got the prime residential land, and the blacks lived in crowded shanty towns. Job opportunities were taken from blacks, and many ended up becoming servants for whites. The reverse was strictly outlawed. When blacks worked for whites as cooks, maids, or nannies, they had to spend extended periods of time away from family, and they earned insufficient wages. Pass laws required non-whites to carry a passport at all times when outside their designated area. Those who didn't have their passport were arrested. Because non-whites comprised a majority of the population, apartheid laws were naturally met with much opposition. The government responded to this opposition with increasingly stricter laws and violent police action. The Sharpeville Massacre is perhaps the most famous instance of police violence. On March 21, 1960, the police in Sharpeville shot hundreds of people protesting apartheid laws. 69 people died that day. The anti-apartheid movement picked up steam after the Sharpeville Massacre. Whites and blacks in South Africa, and even in the United States, joined together against apartheid laws. The Congress of Racial Equality, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, NAACP, and Students for a Democratic Society led demonstrations and demanded that the United States cut all ties to South Africa. Nelson Mandela was the most prominent figure in the anti-apartheid movement. Mandela joined the African National Conference, ANC, in 1943, before the official start of apartheid, with the goal to create a multiracial and united South Africa. In 1962, Mandela illegally left South Africa and searched for funding for the new military division of ANC, a response to the violent Sharpeville massacre. He was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. Nelson Mandela was released on February 11, 1990. In 1991, Mandela was elected president of the ANC. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993. Though the South African government began turning away from apartheid starting in the 1970s, the official end was not announced until February 2, 1990, by President de Klerk. On May 10, 1994, Mandela became the first democratically elected president in the history of South Africa. He served one term. Even though apartheid has been politically defeated, racial inequality in South Africa continues to exist into the 21st century. The white minority population still owned 80% of the land in 2004, 10 years after the end of apartheid. Not surprisingly, hundreds of years of white supremacy have not ended in the 20 years since the end of apartheid. Many white supremacist groups still exist. One man, Reverend Willie Smith, preaches his white supremacy message to thousands across the country. We know that we are God's people. He forbid us to mix with other nations, to marriage with other nations, to live on the same level as they are. We see this ANC government as punishment for abandoning apartheid. South Africa continues to be a racially divided country. Years of missed opportunity for blacks has enabled the white population to maintain a large share of the land, money, and power in the country. Modern-day South Africa is a long way from being Nelson Mandela's vision of a unified country, but thanks to him and the countless others who fought against apartheid, it is a much more equal place than it was under the Nationalist Party.